Hi, everybody. Welcome to Matters That Matter from Hendricks Chapel. Tonight, our special guest is Chris Stedman. Chris is a Minneapolis-based speaker, community organizer, and author. And his forthcoming book is a book that we are very excited to soon have with us. IRL, about meaning, about purpose, and about belonging in our digital lives. Chris, it is great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Chris visited Syracuse University just a few months ago, spoke to a class, had a presentation in Hendricks Chapel, and much has changed since.
Now,
since.
I was reflecting today on how recent that was, but how long ago it feels.
It's really incredible, and I think here we are. You've got this book coming out about how it is that we find realness, how it is that we find meaning, and how it is we find belonging in the digital world. And now here we are, trying to make it work on a Zoom call and trying to deal with technical difficulties and making it work. What better context in that regard? Chris, as we start off this conversation, I'm really fascinated to hear, how did you get to this point? If you don't mind just starting us off by telling us a little bit about your life story and not the whole part, but
No, I mean, I'm laughing at that, but mostly I'm actually laughing at my dog who, speaking of just all the things that we're all trying to make work right now, my dog who has been sleeping quietly for the last several hours suddenly decided it was time to eat dinner.
yeah,
So
yeah.
apologies if you hear her crunching in the background. She also is bringing every piece of food right next to me to eat it by my side. So
Why not? Why
apologies.
if the dog needs to make a special appearance, we're perfectly okay with that.
She just might. We'll see. Anyway, yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit. So I'm here in Minneapolis. I grew up here in Minnesota in a non-religious family, but had a sort of journey over the years in and out of religion as I was trying to find my sort of place in the world where I fit in, where I could find a sense of meaning, of belonging, of realness, of trying to understand sort of who I was and what my responsibility was to the world around me. And that search took me, sort of in and out of faith communities. And ultimately, on the other side of that journey, I ended up sort of recognizing that I had become a Christian when I was around 11 years old, not because it was a sort of genuine expression of the way that I saw the world or how I understood myself in the world and my beliefs, but rather because it provided me this space that was all about trying to make sense of the world, trying to figure out where we belong in the world, what sort of bigger stories we're a part of, and how we can sort of act on our values. And when I realized that was the role that being a Christian was playing in my life, I sort of was able to disentangle it a little bit, and I kind of ended up back where I started, which was in this secular, religiously unaffiliated place, which is a sort of more and more common story. If you're at all familiar with the demographic data, which I know you are, more and more Americans, and particularly millennials, younger Americans, are sort of moving out of traditional institutions, not just religious, but political, civic, all kinds of institutions where people have traditionally made sense of their lives, found a sort of larger narrative that they can plug into, and are instead moving the search for meaning, for a sense of realness and identity, a sense of belonging and purpose, moving all of that work to, or a lot of that work, to digital space. And so, I spent the better part of the last decade working as a humanist chaplain, serving non-religious students at Harvard and at Yale, out east. But ultimately, part of what I came to recognize, and a big part of this actually is, a few years ago, as you know, I started working with some sociologists to do some in-depth research into the lives of religiously unaffiliated Americans, trying to understand where they find a sense of meaning and belonging. And one of the things I started to recognize was that more and more important pieces of our lives were moving into digital space. I think when I was younger, because I grew up in this sort of in-between generation, I didn't I didn't spend my early years online, but as I got older, more and more of my life sort of moved online. And I think when I was younger, I had this sense that the digital was a place where you sort of shared things from your life rather than being a space where life actually happened. And at some point that shifted, and it became less a space where I would sort of go and step into and share things from my life, and more a space where life actually happened, and where rather than being this place I would step into, I was sort of always present in some way, or not, not every single moment of the day, but more and more of my life was happening online. And so that's kind of what got me interested in this exploration that I've been on for the last 4 years or so, trying to make sense of our digital lives, and especially, the word realness, as you mentioned, that's in the subtitle of the book, and for me, that's kind of at the heart of that project, and I think something that a lot of us are now having to confront in ways that we never expected in light of the COVID-19 crisis is, I think we've internalized this idea for years that what happens in digital space is either not real or it's less real. It's a sort of caricature or a shallow version of what we can experience offline. And I think as a result, we find ourselves frequently either suspicious of of what happens in digital space, or dissatisfied by it. It's sort of, we hope it will provide an experience that we have sort of come to expect based on what we experience offline. And I think right now, as many of us are having to scramble, as we did today, to move what would, traditionally have happened in offline space into online space, we find ourselves coming up against challenges, obstacles, and also just the reality that it is different from what we can experience offline. But different doesn't necessarily mean less than. It doesn't mean that what we experience online isn't real, and that it isn't not only a sort of rich space to find meaning, to find connection, but also I open IRL by talking about how we're all digital amateurs. And when you're an amateur at something, like, it doesn't always go well, as we experienced tonight.
Yeah.
But when we're trying things that we're not good at, like when I was in high school, my mom said I had to go out for a sport. And so I went out for cross country, and I was not good at it at all. I was, in fact, like at the very, very back of the team at the beginning of the season. But when you try something you're not good at, in that sort of failure or inelegant sort of attempt to do something new, something that you're still figuring out, you also reveal pieces of yourself. You discover new things about yourself. You have an opportunity to reapproach age-old questions, in this case, questions of, what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to belong, to find connection? We have a chance to sort of reapproach them in new ways, to see them in new lights, and we can learn from that, even if it's not always easy, or sometimes it won't connect to Facebook, and I think, like, as frustrating and fraught and difficult as our digital lives can sometimes feel, there's also so much information there that we can kind of sift through and see new elements of our humanity, as long as we're not sort of expecting them to be these exact replicas of what we can experience offline. It's the same, like, I draw a parallel in IRL to vegan meats. I think if you eat a vegan version of a burger and expect it to taste exactly, I mean, more and more, some of them really are,
Right.
But if you expect it to be this exact replica, at least for me, you're going to be sort of disappointed. But if you allow it to be its own thing, it has its own sort of contribution to make. It has, maybe there are things about it that you don't like as much as, eating meat. Maybe there are things about it, though, that you like more. I think we were talking about this at another point, the kind of the loss and the gain, in that sort of swirl of loss and gain that I think all of us are feeling right now. There's much to be learned. And I'm certainly learning a lot in this very strange time that we find ourselves in. And I imagine the same is true for you.
Well, I love a couple things. The idea of realness and what is real. I've shared with you in the past, and I can share again here for our listeners. The Matrix trilogy continues to be one of my favorite movies.
Oh yeah, I wrote a
Uh,
paper on that my first year of college.
yeah, I think the depth of those films and that question of what is real, and of course, thinking about Plato and the allegory of the cave and what's happening there, and that classic scene of Morpheus and Neo discussing what is real. And what I hear you saying, Chris, is that that's perhaps the conversation that your book is touching upon around, okay, here's this realness, and then the digital world is somehow supplementing that realness. But it sounds like you're problematizing that and helping us to think differently about, well, what does real mean? Am I catching you correctly?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so IRL is this sort of hybrid, it's this combination of sort of first person memoir. So I'm sort of going on this journey, trying to figure out what it means to be human in this digital time that we find ourselves in. But I am also bringing in a lot of research, other people's stories. I did a lot of interviewing and reporting. But, for me, the pieces of myself that I bring in, a lot of what I come back to is these sort of early childhood experiences I had, or adolescent experiences, when I first recognized that I was queer, and really spent a lot of time sort of wrestling with that and not knowing, sort of what and I think this is a common experience that a lot of queer people have. You question yourself a lot. What is, who am I? Is this who I am? What pieces of me, and especially as you sort of begin to come out, and queer people, and I get into this in the book a little bit, sort of learn, and this is not a uniquely queer experience. I think we all experience it in different ways, but you learn to sort of share certain pieces of yourself, and sort of withhold other pieces. And sometimes it's hard to know sort of what of myself is performance, what am I doing for the benefit of others, for my safety, etc., and what is real, what is sort of a genuine expression of myself. And I think that these are like lifelong, age-old things that we all sift through. Who am I? How do I share that with other people? In what ways can I share it that others will understand, will accept? And again, I feel like the digital provides this like very useful tool for looking at the kind of self-monitoring that we all go through life doing, because it sort of shines a light on it. I draw a parallel in IRL to the idea of drag performance, and how the thing about drag is that it's not trying to sort of drag performers aren't trying to sort of blend into the crowd without notice. They're trying to create this kind of hyper real version of what it means to be human, that kind of shines a light on our conventions of what we think gender is, what we think performance is. And I think the digital kind of functions similarly. It's almost this hyper real version in some ways of how we share our lives with one another, how we curate a sense of self and perform a sense of self. And it presents all these opportunities, as you say, to kind of problematize these ideas we have around who am I really, and how do I share that with other people? And again, like when I was working on this book over the last few years, I had no idea, that it would end up coming out at this moment where I think so many of us are now having to, in almost all pieces of our lives, we're having to figure out, how do I forge meaningful, real connections with people through digital tools, people who I love deeply? How do I sort of share my life with people if I can't be in the same space as them? And I read this really, really wonderful book last year called Rising by Elizabeth Rush. It's an exploration of America's wetlands, coastal wetlands, and specifically she looks at how people are trying to sort of restore coastal wetlands because we've filled a lot of them in and built houses on them and that sort of thing. And this has had a huge impact on the ecosystems because we need, coastal wetlands in order, for the sort of whole ecosystem to function. And so people are trying to restore these wetlands, but also they're doing so without knowing sort of what's coming in the future, because the seas are rising due to climate change. And so they're trying to sort of prepare for a future that they don't know what it's going to look like. And she talks about finding this phrase in an essay that she read on Alzheimer's, that the phrase is, sometimes the key arrives before the lock. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because I had no idea over the last 4 years that this obsession of mine, sort of how do we show up as human beings in digital space would, that I was in some ways sort of preparing myself for this moment that we now suddenly find ourselves in, and all of us are trying to prepare for this future that we have no idea what it looks like. Uncertainty is one of the hardest things to endure in life. We're hardwired to run away from uncertainty. And yet we're living in an incredibly uncertain time, not only in the sense of how do we sort of forge meaningful connections online because we have to right now, but also we don't know what the future is going to look like. Are we going to be meeting in person for school in the fall or not? I'm at a campus in Minneapolis, Augsburg University, and we're deeply engaged in those conversations right now, and we don't know. And so I think you and I have talked about this before, but this idea of that people are going to continue to debate. There's the polemics of digital life. They're going to continue to debate whether the digital is real or fake, whether it's good or bad. I personally think we should set that debate aside and move on to the conversation of sort of how do we treat it as real? How do we let it be as real as it can be? How do we allow, the digital to not only, again, it's this sort of swirl of loss and gain. You can focus, if you want, you can focus all day on the losses. I would love to be sitting in the same room as you right now. I feel a sense of loss around that. That's real, but you can get so enmeshed in the loss that you don't focus on the opportunities that the digital provide for unprecedented ways of being human, new ways, novel ways of being and belonging, conversations that we can have that we could never have had before, like this conversation. And so I just think, at the end of the day, if we're fixed to a sense of realness that looks only like what we know already, what we are familiar with, what we are comfortable with, then sure, the digital won't feel real. It will feel like a caricature. It will feel inferior. If we're willing to lean into the unknown of a new way of being real, of connecting, of finding meaning, I think that there's a lot that can be gained from this moment that we find ourselves in. And that's what I'm trying to embrace. It's hard for sure, but yeah.
I like what you say, Chris, about this moment that we find ourselves in. And as you say that, I'm thinking about Mark Twain's quote, who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but history rhymes. And it would seem to me that history is rhymed in the sense of, I would imagine that as books came more into popular culture, when we went to the telegraph, when we went to the telephone. I remember writing my first email and thinking how strange that was, that transition. And it would seem to me that that each time one of these new, shall we say, technologies, modalities comes into our being, that there's a subsequent conversation around, well, what do we lose when we're speaking on the phone rather than having it in person? What do we lose when we instead read something in a written text rather than being shared in an oral tradition, and so on and so forth? But it seems to me that we can find some commonalities in those conversations around that sense that how do we find a sense of belonging, regardless of what, in my world and at Augsburg University as well, regardless of what the fall looks like, how are we creating a sense of belonging? How are we finding opportunities for people to explore meaning and to receive realness? I mean, it would seem that in some ways we've been here before.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet, so I think that point is very well made. And that's something that I try to sort of explore in IRL. Is the sense, right, that, technological alarmism is a tale as old as time. It's existed from the very beginning of any sort of, sort of technological advancement that we've made. There's always fear of change and what will be lost. That doesn't mean that we should just, unquestioningly embrace any sort of technology. Of course we should wrestle with these things and grapple with these things. I think the challenge is like, there were people there have been sort of thinkers in the past who, would look at the technology that we have available to us today and would say, oh, with that kind of technology, all people should be freed up to be poets and philosophers. And, that hasn't been the reality, right? In fact, like, email, the invention of email, which should make our lives simpler, in many ways makes it more complicated. I spend, now people can send you so many emails that you can spend all day responding to emails, as I'm sure you have, I certainly have in my life. And so, these things that are supposed to improve our lives, that are supposed to free up more time for us to think about what gives our lives meaning, sometimes can become things that keep us busy, that keep us spinning in the wheel. And so ultimately, it's not about the technology, right? It's about how we use it. There was a study that came out last year, a longitudinal study, I think it was an 8-year study out of Brigham Young University, that looked at young people's social media use. And the thing that they found was that, there's this idea that the more time we spend online, the unhappier we are. We see all kinds of studies suggesting that time online and unhappiness, loneliness, stress, these things are correlated. This study suggests that actually it's less about how much time you spend online and rather how sort of intentional you're being about what you're doing online. If you're sort of mindlessly, feeding quarters into the slot machine of our digital, desire for likes and retweets and whatever, and you're just sort of mindlessly scrolling, then that often you will feel dissatisfied by the end of that. It's that sort of mindless play. It's like gambling or, but there is a difference between that and mindful play, the kind of deep play that we enter into elsewhere and we can online. And so, when I think about how we find meaning and belonging online, for me, the trick always comes in like, am I being honest with myself about what needs I'm trying to meet by entering into digital space? Am I being self-aware, reflective about, how I'm spending my time? Or am I just sort of, reflexively grabbing my phone first thing in the morning and looking at my Twitter? And there are very significant differences between mindless and mindful practice in general. And so I don't buy the sort of doom and gloom around the sort of encroachment of the digital into all areas of our lives, but I do fear, I think we're not encouraged to be mindful in how we use these things, certainly. I mean, the platforms themselves have a financial interest in keeping us clicking and scrolling, and that is how they monetize our free time. And so, ultimately, we're not encouraged to reflect on our digital practices because we're told they're not real or they're less real, or and so we really have our work cut out for us in some ways. But again, that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. It just means that we need to be intentional about what we're doing.
I wonder, I wouldn't want to go through this conversation without thinking about, the toxicity of our public discourse in these days, in the sense of, and there's many different ways to look at it. I think I hear the train of thought of those and saying, look, the digital communication amplifies. It's like the thermometer or thermostat argument, right? It's like a thermometer. It just amplifies, and that it's bad. That social media is bad because it allows people to say whatever they want. But then there's another argument that says, well, but it's just simply revealing what's already there. And then there's a spectrum, of course, between those two. But I'd love to, if you just had any just general thoughts based upon your research, your writing, because it seems like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten a lot of harassment online over the years, so I'm very sympathetic to that perspective. Yeah, that's a whole conversation for another day. But Yeah. But I do, I get it. And yet I really like the image of the digital as a kind of funhouse mirror of society, in the sense that it does distort in some ways, but it also reflects, it reveals, as you say, it shows pieces of who we are. It also shows it has the ability to sort of embolden or distort elements of our humanity as well. And so again, I think mindful use really matters here. We need to be able to look honestly at what we're using. I write in IRL about like this gradual embrace of just trying to like be a little bit more honest online. I think for years I felt very like I just overthought, the kind of image I was trying to project, and I felt like I really needed to be a responsible representative of my communities, as an LGBT person, as an atheist, and a religious minority, and I just felt like I was walking this tightrope all the time. And then, gradually, I started to just loosen the restraints I had put upon myself a little bit. And I did have a few friends come to me and say like, oh, it's interesting. I didn't realize that you were like being so fake online before, and that now you're being more real. But the truth of the matter is, it's not that I was being fake before. It's just that I've always been sort of both people. I've always been, someone who cares deeply about the work that I've done, and about, trying to sort of help find understanding across lines of difference. And I've always been a petty, occasionally sarcastic, person. And it's just that I sort of made more for one of those things, and sort of kept the other to myself. And I don't think you need to put everything out there. Certainly, I think it's, it's worth thinking about what you're sharing and that sort of thing. But I also think that you can, or at least I feel this way, you can kind of sense when somebody is overthinking their sort of digital presence. It doesn't, you can feel the difference between someone who is trying to sort of genuinely themselves, and someone who's trying to, have a brand. And I think that, that you can easily overcorrect in the other direction, and sort of not think at all about what you're sharing and how you're treating other people, and not bring your sort of the norms that you try to practice in other parts of your lives, the values you try to maintain. It's, it's easy in digital space. And, there's a whole chapter in IRL about the sort of distance that we experience online, and how there's positives, we can bridge distances that we couldn't before, but also, we can hold each other at arm's length online and see one another as less human than we might if we had to be in the same room. And so it's not that you shouldn't think about those things, but also, it's okay to be human, right? I mean, I think there is this pressure that we all feel. A fundamental part of what it means to be human, I think, is to be multiple, right? You have different facets of yourself that you share with different people in your life, and there's good in that. And yet online, you have to sort of be everything for everybody. You have to present a digital self that is acceptable to your parents, your friends, your professors, your future employers, people you might date in the future. It has to be an acceptable self for this wide audience of people, and that's just not possible. It requires a degree of flattening out that I think is that makes us feel inauthentic. And so I just have tried, I think, to worry less about those audiences and more about just trying to share myself in digital space. And as a result, I enjoy my time online more. But I think it's a hard line to walk. And I think part of what we will gain from more of our lives moving into digital space is having to, I think the reason we feel that pressure is because we're not comfortable as a species, as a society, with people being more than one thing, with people contradicting themselves, being complicated, which we all are. And that is, it's an essential piece of what it means to be human. And rather than seeing the digital as this source of stress around that, I see it in this opportunity for us to be more honest about that, about the fact that we are all complex, contradictory. We all can be both deeply caring about the world around us and other people, and petty at the same time.
I love what you're saying about that, Chris. And as one of our great connection points, you're talking about Augsburg University with its connection to the Lutheran Church. And I say with pride, as a Lutheran pastor myself, I loved when the former presiding bishop, Mark Hansen, had talked about his favorite word in Lutheran theology being the word "and." And I remember when he spoke those words, and I love that sense of paradox in Lutheran theology that Martin Luther talks about being both saints and sinners, Jesus being both human and divine, and the list just goes on, that in a world that tries to push us to the either or, you can live into that both and it would seem to me that you're exploring that a bit, that we can be all of those things at once. And it makes me think about, and as you know, I love the subtitle of your book, and I love the way in which we're talking about meaning, and that search for meaning, and that search for belonging, that search for realness, and how in some ways this moment that we're finding ourselves in, when our routines have been stripped away, when the things that we've been accustomed to are stripped away, that vulnerability is very revealing of our character, of our identity, of our purpose, and so on and so forth. We're noticing that with the students at Syracuse, that burst of energy towards trying to go into those deeper questions, which has been quite extraordinary. And I would imagine that your book coming out in this time would be really helpful. So without putting you in a tough position to ask for like guru advice to our students or to our listeners, I would just love some thoughts, because it's hard not to have this conversation, to think about this context that we find ourselves in. So just thoughts for folks that are just searching for belonging, searching for meaning. Just things from the book, some helpful thoughts for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, first, I love that you brought up Mark Hansen. I feel like he's, so I work with Mark at Augsburg, but also we've developed this, at least to me, I don't want to speak for him, but this very unlikely friendship. I don't find it unlikely, but I think it would look unlikely to the world outside of us. We're very different in many different ways. And yet I feel like he's one of the people I feel like I can be most myself with. And I think that speaks to, like, when thinking about this question you ask, what are some sort of tips, or I am trying, and it's hard, but I'm trying to sort of lean into the necessity of this moment, to sort of say, like, okay, if all the ways that I have, or if many of the ways, because this is not, even though the particular moment we find ourselves in is new in a sense, like this, we've been sort of training. The key arrived before the lock years ago. We've been moving more and more of our lives into online space, so we're actually more ready for this than I think we are. But also, like, I'm okay. If the ways that I have sort of traditionally found connection, meaning, realness with other people are not available to me right now, then I'm just going to lean into this moment all the way and try things I would normally not try, and approach them with this kind of, I talk in IRL about this idea, this philosophical idea of experimental certainty. So approach something with this idea that it has something to teach you that maybe you weren't expecting, something that might surprise you about yourself. And so I'm trying to just treat all of the digital connection, the digital sort of pieces of my life right now as spaces that have something to teach me about what it means to be human, even if I have no idea what that is yet. And I think if you remove the walls that we put in place around sort of what is a space where real life happens and what is not, if you just say, okay, we're going to do away with those walls right now, and I'm going to treat all of this as space where real life can happen, you might be surprised. I mean, I never thought I would be a gamer. I didn't grow up in a video game household. We didn't have video games. And I always kind of looked at video games as a result as like silly trifles, not something meaningful. And when this all started, I was sort of like, okay, well, maybe this is a time to give video games a try. I mean, I'm stuck at home. I live in a tiny studio apartment, so like, that seems like a good option. So I got a Nintendo Switch, and a couple friends of mine who are gamers were like, you should try a couple games. They made some suggestions. One of them was this game called Zelda Breath of the Wild, which has totally blown my mind. It's this like incredibly beautiful story, this opportunity to sort of explore this world. And even though I'm doing it by myself, it sort of makes me feel like I'm a part of something larger in a way that I would have never guessed. And then Animal Crossing, which is a very popular game, lots of people like, where you make your own island and other animals live on it, but also friends through online play can come visit your island and that sort of thing. And I went on a date with someone in Animal Crossing. He like came to my island and we had like a date in the video game, which is not something I would have ever tried in normal times, and yet was like very nice, And so I think even though, and I don't want to downplay the ways in which this moment, for many reasons, feels very challenging for a lot of us. I absolutely get that, and I don't think that like denying that is the answer at all. But I do think that if you're not going to do yourself any favors by being like, okay, well, I'm just going to do this stuff that's sort of inferior in the meantime until all of this ends, because again, we're in a very uncertain moment. We don't know what the future will hold, and so sort of putting your whole life on pause, and sort of just trying to get by in the meantime, to me doesn't feel like a very good way to take care of myself. I want to keep living my life. And so instead of saying I'm going to try these sort of shallow versions of something else I'd rather be doing, or these inferior things, I try to, I think of my friend Carrie, who's this investigative journalist who sort of investigates what she calls extraordinary claims. So sort of miracle cures, sort of things that seem fantastical in some way. But, unlike a lot of sort of skeptics, people who go in sort of trying to disprove something like that, she always talks about going in kind of hopeful, hoping each time, like, maybe this one is real, going in sort of with wonder, with this experimental certainty. What does this thing have to teach me that maybe I'm not expecting? And so, that's what I'm trying to do right now, with all the digital pieces of my life, to say like, what in this, rather than being this sort of inferior version of something else I'd rather be doing, what can this teach me about what it means to be human? What does this have to offer me that maybe I'm not expecting? And I have been very pleasantly surprised as a result. And so I guess that's the one piece of advice I would give for now. There's much more I could say, but
I appreciate that, Chris. I mean, what I love is, and again, we're talking about, being at Augsburg, and I think about the commitments of Augsburg University, and again, when I think about my own life growing up in the Lutheran Church, that sense of vocation, of how it is that we can explore meaning, purpose, joys, and having that inward facing look, but then also alongside of that, trying to be cognizant of the needs of the world. And it seems like in this time, like, there are so many people going through a really tough time right now. And for us to be mindful, to think, what is it that are my joys and passions and gifts? And what is it that the world is yearning from me at this time? And that I appreciate what at least I hear you saying is that we should be able to search for vocation. We should be able to search for meaning, purpose, belonging, realness in this digital space. And that too, I think, is part of that living into that paradoxical nature of life, where at any given moment, there are people who are experiencing the deepest grief, sorrow, and suffering imaginable. And at that exact same time, somewhere in the world, someone's experiencing just joy and pleasure and happiness. And those realities are happening all at once. And I want to thank you, Chris, for your book, for your commitments. And I think clearly it was a great book when you thought of it for the first time. And clearly in this moment that we find ourselves in, undoubtedly people are going to find it really helpful. For those that are listening in,
I hope so.
for those that are listening in, we're going to be posting the details of that book. Just as a bit of housekeeping, we originally hoped to broadcast this live at 7 p.m. Eastern time. We had some technical difficulties, and so now we're posting this recorded version. Chris, I'm so thankful that you stuck around and that we were able to record this and to share this conversation. So Chris, just thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I look forward to connecting digitally again soon.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining in. We look forward to being in touch. Have a great day.